Hey, my name is Drew Boa, founder of Husband Material, where I help men outgrow porn. Today we are talking about sexual energy in singleness. What do I do with all of my pent up sexual energy, especially if I'm single? Who is this episode for? Well, it is for single guys, especially single guys who wish they were married but aren't for one reason or another. It's also for guys who don't want to be married and are still asking these same questions. Maybe you experience same-sex attraction and you're committed to celibacy. Or you're married, but you feel stuck because your attractions are not for your spouse. Maybe you used to be married and now you're divorced. This episode is also for guys who are married, but are not having sex for one reason or another. At some point in life, we all ask, what do I do with the sexual energy that is coursing through my body? Today, you will learn the two types of sexual energy we experience, why singleness can feel like a sexual curse. You'll learn about God's good design for sexuality and singleness, and you'll get some real life examples of Christian men actually enjoying singleness, not just tolerating it, not just getting through it, but delighting in this stage of life. Ultimately, this episode is for everyone because although not all of us will be married, all of us will be single. Now or later, or if you believe in Christianity, even after death. Marriage is temporary. Singleness is the primary state that we find ourselves in. I realize that this concept of sexual energy might need a little bit of explaining. So first, let me explain the two types of sexual energy that we're talking about today. Urges and aches. A sexual urge is a short, intense burst of energy, like the urge to masturbate or the urge to look at pornography. It can feel like a geyser. It can feel like an uncontrollable, intense urge. There are also sexual aches. A sexual ache is not short or intense. It's long-standing, continuous, dull pain. Not like a geyser, more like a lazy river, a slow, low flow that continues, and over time, it makes a big impact. Although a geyser is harder to control in the moment, I think an ache can be even more painful. So an example of a sexual ache might be the dull, continuous longing for a romantic relationship, maybe for a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or a spouse. And sexual urges and aches can both be fertile ground for unwanted behavior, especially unwanted sexual behavior, and especially for singleness. When you're single or you have no sexual outlet, so to speak, you can feel like your sexual urges and aches are a problem. They can feel like a burden. Even though God created our sexuality as a blessing, it can feel like a burden. And I think, especially in our culture, singleness can feel like a curse. In today's day and age, here are 3 reasons why I believe singleness can really feel like a curse: deprivation, depression, and dread. First, deprivation. In our culture, romantic love and relationships are held up as the highest form of connection and pleasure and satisfaction in life. And so if you are not in that kind of relationship, or you are, but there's no romantic connection, then you can feel deprived, like I'm missing out on something that I'm entitled to. And naturally, that can make porn and other unwanted sexual behavior seem really appealing because it's providing a version of what you feel like you're entitled to or what you're being deprived of. And our culture is not really set up for single people to experience deep connection and community. We're so individualistic. We're so career-oriented. We don't live in the same type of social fabric as people have had historically. So naturally, it makes sense that oftentimes single people are being deprived of physical touch, for example, or emotional intimacy. Even the intimacy of coming into the kitchen and having a casual conversation rather than just making breakfast alone every day and wishing you had someone to talk to. And over time, Deprivation can result in depression and losing your motivation, losing your passion, losing the joy in life. The thought of spending the next few decades as a single person can be overwhelming. It can bring fear, anxiety, despair. And the word that captures it the most for me is dread. It's that feeling of a looming darkness that is unavoidable. So these are the reasons why I believe singleness can really feel like a curse. Deprivation, depression, and dread. And that's why I've decided to create this episode, because I want to give you a vision. I want to give you hope. I want to give you a picture of how singleness can be good and beautiful. And it doesn't have to be depressing and dreadful and depriving. The truth is, even when you're single, your sexuality is an amazing gift. It is a good gift from God to you and through you to the world. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. But first, it might be helpful to clarify, what do we mean by sexuality? If I'm saying that sexuality is good, what are we really talking about here? The Latin root of the word sex is secare, which means to cut off, to sever, to amputate. And that is a really helpful picture of what it means to be sexed or to have a sexuality in this world. Here's a quote from Pastor Dave Lomas. It's kind of long, but I think it really captures the heart of what it means to come into this world as a sexual being. He says, "If you were to take the branch of a tree and cut it off from the tree, you could say you have sexed the branch. You have cut off the branch. If this branch woke up the next day, severed, cut off, disconnected, a lonely piece of wood, which was once part of the great organism that is the tree, the branch would wake up knowing in every cell of its being that if it wants to continue living, if it wants to produce flowers and bear fruit, it must somehow reconnect itself to the tree. So to be cut off is to be sexed. Our strong desire for sex, especially once we reach puberty, is our painful awareness that every cell of our body, psyche, and soul is sexed. It's cut off. Sex in its basic form is the dimension of our awareness, sometimes subconscious, that we carry in our bodies, that we have been cut off, and that we want to be reconnected. Here's my summary of what he just said. Sexuality is our sense of incompleteness that drives us out of ourselves to pursue connection. Connection with God, connection with others, connection with ourselves, connection with this beautiful world. God created us to be discontent in isolation, to be discontent with loneliness. And that's actually a good thing. Sexuality is our divinely designed engine for intimacy that pushes us to get off the couch, get up, and connect with the world, whether through another person or through the amazing creation or with the Creator. And God created sex and sexuality to reveal and express His love, both in marriage and in singleness. Now, in general, a lot of people talk about God's design for sex and sexuality in marriage, but not so much in singleness. It's like, well, when you're single, just wait until you're married and then you can fulfill God's design for sex. No. Let me explain the core of God's design, because I think it's exactly the same, maybe not exactly the same, but it's mostly the same in singleness and in marriage. Let me take a moment to just quickly summarize God's design for sex and sexuality in marriage, and then we'll get to singleness, and you will see what I'm talking about when I say that they are so similar. In marriage, sex and sexuality are good when they lead to connection and pleasure and creativity for both people. Sex is good when it leads to connection, when it is bonding, unifying, creating a sense of intimacy that's not just physical, that's emotional, that's spiritual. It's also good when it's pleasurable. And God created our bodies to experience pleasure, including sexual pleasure. And there is one part of the female body which serves no reproductive function, no other function. It is just for pleasure. And that is the clitoris or clitoris. And that is an example of how God created our bodies to experience pleasure, just for its own sake. And then lastly, creativity. Sex is the way that we as humans procreate. And the very first command that God ever gave in the Bible is be fruitful and multiply. Now, in a similar way, sexuality in singleness is good when it leads you into greater connection, greater pleasure, and greater creativity. That's my big argument today. What does it look like to really enjoy single sexuality? It looks like connection and pleasure and creativity. When your sexual energy is strong, whether you're experiencing an urge or an ache, if it leads you into connection and pleasure and creativity, then God's design is doing its job. And let me be very clear. Of course, singleness is difficult. Just like marriage. Marriage is difficult. It's messy. It's a struggle sometimes. There's suffering involved. And when you can align it with God's design, it is amazing. Don't you want more connection and pleasure and creativity? If your sexuality can lead you into those things, it will become a blessing to you. On the other hand, if it's an area of your life where you experience deprivation and depression and dread, of course it feels like a curse. Let me give you some examples of husband material men who are living this out and actually enjoying singleness and allowing that engine for intimacy to drive them into greater connection and pleasure and creativity. Let's start with connection. John is a member of the husband material community who says, I've been divorced for 12 years. In the first few years after my wife divorced, with no marriage covenant to hold me back, I sought men online for sex. I realized quickly what a dead end that is. So in the following years, I tried to understand what a healthy expression of sexual energy is for someone who has chosen celibacy. And here's what he says about that. I make connection a priority. I am privileged to be able to travel, and I always include connection with brothers as part of my travel plans. I love to entertain and host people in my home. Rather than lamenting loneliness, I create community. I am living a life I never would have chosen. I never would have chosen celibacy, but I am seeking to live faithfully the life God has given me and to focus my sexual energy on things that are life-giving and not destructive to me and others. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that so beautiful that he's taking his sexual urges and aches and allowing them to do their job of leading him into connection? And he's not the only one. I've heard of some other husband material men who are meeting up with each other in person, even outside of our retreats. And it's so beautiful to see this connection happening, especially for the single guys. As a married man, my capacity for connection with a wide variety of friends or brothers is limited. And also as a parent, my social sphere is a lot smaller than it used to be when I was single. And that's one of the gifts of singleness, is that it allows you a breadth and a depth of all kinds of friendships that are really hard to come by when you're married or when you're raising kids. But as you've heard me say earlier, and as you've probably experienced, finding deep, lasting male friendships is so difficult, especially long-term friendships that you can really count on, friendships that are committed and cultivated over time. And that's why I want to recommend to you a podcast episode that a member of our community shared with me called Finding Intimacy and Community as a Celibate Gay Christian. It's an episode of Theology in the Raw, hosted by Preston Sprinkle, interviewing Art Pereira, who is in a committed friendship with his friend Nick. Nick is married, however, they live in the same house, and they have a covenantal type of friendship. And in the interview, Art talks all about the challenges, the heartache, the pain, the need for forgiveness and reconciliation in long-term committed friendships, how this has been so important for him to be embracing God's good design for singleness. And here's my favorite quote from the episode. He says, "The notion that romantic and sexual love is the only love worth celebrating is really modern. It's really American, and it's really unhealthy. No one would ever read the Bible and come up with the framework of community we have today. The Bible is filled with amazing, beautiful friendship. And he's an example of someone who has made sacrifices to develop that kind of friendship to fulfill his deeper desires and needs, rather than suppressing his deeper desires and needs or just expressing them in unhealthy or harmful ways. He is taking the difficult road of pursuing his desires according to God's design. And God's design is for us to experience connection. So go check out that episode. I've included a link in the show notes because, my friend, you can have real intimacy, community, and friendship as a single person. It will be difficult, it will look different, and it will be worth it. So those are two examples of connection as a single person. You have John, who's traveling around to visit all his brothers around the world. And then you have Art, who lives with one of his closest friends, even though his friend is married, and they have a committed covenantal friendship. Those are just two examples, and I hope they help give you some more imagination for how singleness can be a blessing when it leads you into connection. It can also lead you into pleasure. Here are two more examples of Christian men enjoying pleasure as a single person. Rob is a member of the husband material community who has found a lot of freedom and growth in mindfully building his sexual energy instead of just suppressing it or shutting it down or just letting it control him. In his words, he says, "I am allowing a buildup of sexual tension in the prostate, genital, and lower abdominal region. The objective is not to be obsessed with ejaculation, but to be mindful and present with the body during your own arousal." He says, "I can literally feel the masculine energy growing in me day by day as I have longer amounts of time since my last orgasm." He says, "Porn doesn't work with this because you're taking your mind to an external stimuli instead of internal awareness and arousal." Let me translate that a little bit for you. Basically, instead of being aroused, Rob is choosing to be with his arousal, to be aware of it, to embrace it in the sense of welcoming it into his experience. This is very different from trying to make that tension go away, either through fighting against it or just giving into it. Being with your body and being with the sexual energy building up can actually have some benefits. Rob says, "A mild ongoing horniness that is harnessed and controlled gives me an aggressive edge that can be redirected toward weightlifting, running, or doing something physically exerting." Other noticed benefits of building up sexual energy include a sense of deeper body awareness and connectedness with my own body, and an overall feeling more masculine and bold and willing to take risks. I realize that story may or may not resonate with some of you and may be difficult to conceive of. Like, really, just allowing myself to feel the tension and feel the energy building up can be helpful somehow? Here's the point. As a single person, or as a person who's not engaging in sexual activity, you don't have to ignore your penis. It's a good part of you. It's a beautiful part of you. And when you learn how to be with it, rather than battle against it or be controlled by it, you'll find that it doesn't have to be your enemy. It could be your friend, even as a single person. And that feels weird to say, partly because mindfulness is just not something that most of us learn. Most of us have been taught. However, it can be a really beautiful, powerful way of embracing all that is within you, embracing every part of you, including your genitals, and including the sexual energy that occasionally builds up. Here's why this matters. When your sexual energy is strong and the urges are raging or the aches just feel unbearable, you have two choices. You can passively choose pleasure, followed by pain through unwanted sexual behavior, or we can choose to be with the pain, the tension, and the discomfort, followed by the pleasure and satisfaction that comes after. If it really is true that sexuality is a gift, not just for married people, but for single people, then I believe there is something good for you in experiencing these urges and experiencing these aches and just allowing them to be. You can experience your strength and not allowing them to control you. You can have a greater sense of alignment and attunement and awareness of your body. And if you don't resonate with this concept of being with your arousal and your sexual energy, that's okay. Rob's story is just one example of pleasure, and there are lots of other examples. Here's another one. My friend Steve is in his 50s. He never married, although he has wanted to be married for a long time. He's single. And a few years ago, Steve chose the pleasure and delight of co-owning a sailboat on Lake Michigan. This sailboat is a place where he invites his students to come. He invites his friends to come and his family, friends that have become family. He's the uncle to some of their kids. He's someone who I look up to as an example of a man who's truly enjoying life as a single person, and his sailboat is a great example of that. Steve's sailboat is a place where he experiences pleasure in his body, and not just in his genitals, or not just as a secondary type of pleasure that's not as good as an orgasm. Rather, it's a more fully embodied pleasure. The penis is just one little area of pleasure. I realize this might be hard for some of you single guys to imagine, but an orgasm is not the highest form of pleasure in the world. In fact, it's a type of pleasure that is very narrowly focused to one part of your body. A more fuller, embodied pleasure engages all of your senses, not just one. And that's part of why the mindfulness we talked about earlier is important. When Steve gets on his sailboat, he is experiencing pleasure in a much fuller way, not only in connection with the people he's invited to join him. But think about it. Imagine yourself out on that sailboat on Lake Michigan. You can feel the wind on your skin. You can hear the birds calling overhead. You can see the shapes of the clouds and the blue sky. You can grab a snack and taste the food on your tongue and actually chew it slowly before you swallow it. This is what it looks and feels like to come home to your body, because the largest organ in your body is the skin. The skin has a remarkable capacity for pleasure all over, not just in the genital area. There is so much pleasure in a hug. There is so much pleasure in a joyful hello. And when you're single, you are not consigned to a secondary form of pleasure that's just not as good as what everybody else is experiencing. Rather, you have an opportunity to get creative and be proactive in pursuing a pleasure that engages more aspects of you than just your penis. Now, I'm not trying to say that a sailboat can be a replacement for sexual activity. What I am saying is that when your urges are strong and your aches are unbearable, you can take that as an invitation from God to pursue pleasure, real pleasure, the kind of pleasure that truly satisfies, a pleasure that's proactive, that doesn't avoid pain or try to escape pain, but embraces pain on the way to pleasure, rather than passively consuming pleasure on the way to more pain. I hope that makes sense. Singleness is not an obstacle to enjoying life. Rather, it's an opportunity to get creative and proactive about enjoying life in all kinds of different ways. For example, out on a sailboat, I encourage you to find your sailboat, to find pleasure in your body that is greater than just one little isolated form of pleasure that we call the orgasm. Here's the challenge in today's culture. We live in an age of digital disembodiment, which makes it really hard for us to experience pleasure because there is so much of it at our fingertips. The book that really helps me understand this is Dopamine Nation by Anna Lemke, who says, we've transformed the world from a place of scarcity to a place of overwhelming abundance. Drugs, food, news, gambling, shopping, gaming, texting, sexting, Facebooking, Instagramming, YouTubing, tweeting. Highly rewarding stimuli today is staggering. The smartphone is the modern day hypodermic needle, delivering digital dopamine 24/7 for a wired generation. Part of the reason why it's so difficult for singleness to feel rewarding is because we have numbed ourselves with our digital dopamine pumps. And so our capacity for pleasure is a lot lower. Lemke writes, the reason we're all so miserable may be because we're working so hard to avoid being miserable. The pursuit of pleasure for its own sake leads to the inability to enjoy pleasure of any kind. And here's the solution that she proposes. She says, I urge you to find a way to immerse yourself fully in the life you've been given, to stop running from whatever you're trying to escape, and instead stop and turn and face whatever it is. Then I dare you to walk toward it. In this way, the world may reveal itself to you as something magical and awe-inspiring that does not require escape. Instead, the world may become something worth paying attention to. Do you hear the beauty of mindfulness in that quote? We can stop, pay attention to the world around us, and experience pleasure where we are, right now in our senses. As single people, as married people, sexual pleasure is not required to enjoy life. As a single man or as a sexually inactive man, you can enjoy life. Yes, it will be painful. It will involve slowing down, unplugging, and paying attention, and it will be worth it. Our sexuality can be something that drives us to connection and pleasure, and lastly, creativity. And for this one, I want to use an example from my own life. A few months ago, I was sitting on the couch at 11 p.m., really struggling. I was in one of those dark emotional and mental states where it feels like nothing matters, where it feels like life is too difficult. It reminded me of some of the days when I was single and really sad, but not even being present to the sadness, just numbing myself. It was a horrible night. I don't know if you've ever felt that way. It was such a struggle. In fact, it reminded me of how I felt after my first breakup. In 2012, on Christmas Day, my first girlfriend broke up with me over email. And over the next few months, I was depressed. And I thought to myself, I'll never be in another relationship. I don't want to go through that again. I imagined myself as single for the rest of my life. And there was a depression, there was a deprivation, there was a despair, and unwanted sexual behavior came back into my life stronger than before at that time. And I was feeling those kinds of feelings again. Feelings of despair. Feelings of just wanting to get away from it all. And that night, what I really felt the urge to do was get on my phone and distract myself for the next hour. Just scroll or drift or get into something that really could have led me into unwanted sexual behavior. And I thought about that and realized, gosh, that's not really what I want to do, but I don't see an alternative. And I remember something that I once taught and that has always stuck with me. When our sexual energy is strong, I thought, I have a choice in this moment. I can consume or I can create. I can be a consumer and passively scroll social media or drift around on the internet for the next hour, or I can be present to this pain and create something out of it. And that's what I did. I ended up writing a song, and it was a song brutally honest about how despondent I was feeling in the moment. The song started with the words, "Where is the goodness of the Lord? Is he sleeping? We are suffering. Where is the beauty of the Lord? Is he hiding? We have waited long. All his saving work is not done. There is still more to overcome." And the song became, "The Lord will fight for you." And that is actually a quote from Exodus 14:14, which is what Moses said to the Israelites when they were despondent, when they were in despair, when they felt like they were trapped and powerless, and there was nothing they could do with the Egyptian army coming after them and the Red Sea on the other side. They could see no way out. And that's how I felt that night. And I think that's how a lot of men feel in singleness. I took that struggle, I took those urges and aches, and instead of consuming passively, I chose to create something. And it turned into a song that has now been sung by husband material men, and we even recorded an amazing version of it. So I'm including a link to that song in the show notes. You can check it out. The Lord Will Fight For You. And through that creativity, something beautiful came into the world. Isn't it amazing that those emotions, which I really didn't want to feel, that the urges and aches, which I would gladly eliminate from my life, actually had a purpose. They were leading me into something creative. That's what I want to emphasize for guys who are single. You can take your sexual energy and turn it into something creative. Emotional pain, sexual tension does not have to be a curse. It can be a blessing, not just a blessing to you, but even a blessing through you when it becomes creative. I want to challenge you to take your sexual urges and aches and turn them into something creative. Write a song, ride a bike, bake a cake, sing, dance, cry, mourn, lament, play, jump, draw, paint, craft, cook, move, walk, hike, climb, plan, design, build, hug, or just be. Guys, we are conditioned, especially by pornography, to be consumers. But God made us to be creators. Consuming is passive, creating is active. Consuming is easy, creativity requires effort. Consuming is often safe, but creating is vulnerable. Let me tell you, yes, it was creative, and yet it was also very vulnerable to write that song. I didn't know if it was going to be good. I leaned into it. That story about me writing that song was a one-time thing that I felt the Holy Spirit was leading me into. But the next time you find yourself feeling really strong sexual urges and aches, I wonder what kind of creative outlet you might be able to channel your energy into. Because my friend, you are a man. You are a creator. You have a choice of what to do with your sexual energy. Will you consume or will you create? I believe all sexuality at the core is good. Whether you're single or married, whether you're sexually active or not, your sexuality is a good, beautiful gift to you and even to the world. Singleness gives us a great opportunity to experience God and overflow His love in a unique way. But deprivation, depression, and dread loom large and threaten to turn our singleness into a curse. So, what can we do with our sexual energy, especially in singleness? Pursue connection, pleasure, and creativity. Like John, you can create community. Like Art Pereira, you can form committed friendships. Like Rob, you can be with your body. Like Steve, you can find pleasure in powerful and unexpected ways. And like me, you can turn your suffering and your struggles into something creative. My friend, please don't give in to deprivation and depression and dread. Instead, pursue connection, pleasure, and creativity. I know it won't be easy. There will be disappointment and grief along the way. If you continue down this road, the good news is, over time, you can find your deeper needs and desires satisfied so that porn loses its power over you and singleness feels less like a curse and more like a blessing. I realize that in some ways this episode is an oversimplification, and there are lots of scenarios that I haven't talked about, and it's not just as simple as, do this and you'll get these results. My hope, though, is that you have a little bit more vision, a little bit more space, and a little bit more hope that singleness is not a curse. It can be a blessing. And I wonder which of those three areas is most important for you right now: connection, pleasure, or creativity. In any case, thanks for listening, and always remember you are God's beloved son, In you he is well pleased.